You are listening to No PC Allowed, aka No Political Correctness Allowed, and I am Mac Iverson. Why am I calling civil rights Snivel rights? Because sniff, cry, and snivel is what libtard babies do when they can't get the socialist government that they all dream of. Don't think for one moment that Trump's executive orders will change everything overnight. The battle for Americans' true rights is just beginning. But we must understand why these extra-constitutional snivel rights are so bad for America. In the following moments, we will re-examine the 1964 Snivel Rights Act. Power brokers always want to create distractions for simpletons to become hypnotized while they grab more power by taking away our freedoms. There were two competing ideologies in the 60s, integration and separate but equal. The libtards try to equate Jim Crow laws with separate but equal, but blacks weren't treated equally at all. Therefore, Jim Crow and equal segregation are two entirely different concepts. Justly applied separate but equal could have avoided all of the nowhere-going race riots going all the way back to the 1950s. But that would have required a well-informed, responsible, and moral population, one that did not fully exist in America in the 50s and 60s, let alone today. In post-World War II, America was moving in that direction. This was especially true for blacks. Black America was getting richer, they were getting stronger, and families were largely still fully intact before all this civil rights activity went down. 62 years later, Black America is worse off in many ways, mostly due to welfare dependency, which quickly followed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the civil rights movement was sponsored by elites to try and upset the progress of blacks as much as possible. Empowered blacks were bad for the carpetbagging business that went all the way back to 1865 in the post-Civil War South. That's because there is big money and power in the maintaining of animosity between the races, with the constant drumbeat of, "You colored folks ain't got all that whitey has," covetousness. Again, peaceful race relations requires a population that is self-reliant, uncomplaining, and not covetous of their neighbor's success. As long as the American church is not articulating God's word verse by verse every Sunday and interpreting the scriptures correctly, as long as that's not happening, then people will always be fooled by the empty promises of opportunistic politicians who try to convince the simple-minded that if only you had just a few extra constitutional rights above what the majority white Christian male boogeyman has, if only, then you too could be on equal footing with him, and then you could finally be happy and satisfied in life. You don't need God anymore for that. Now you need politics. It's a fool's dream, of course. But as long as the power brokers are always pointing their dirty, greasy little fingers at someone else who is responsible for the personal failures of their constituents, there will always be those useful idiot voters who believe them and give them that power. The ongoing solution, and you'll hear this continuously on this podcast until this takes hold permanently, is that the church must return to God's word and get away from longhorn preaching, which is two woke points at the beginning and end of a sermon with a whole lot of bull in between. Until we graduate away from that, America will always be scratching at the door of success but never fully permanently coming through. For example, Trump and his success in 2024, but it will always be just out of reach again as soon as he leaves office in less than 3 short years. America's main problem is never political. That is pure illusion. It is spiritual. To be more precise, it is a lack of Jesus' words in context with the rest of the Bible. But as long as big money donations continues to dumb down and dominate the church, we will never permanently crawl out of this hole of unholiness that we have dug for ourselves. By permanently, I mean simply one generation. That's because in our high-tech age, everything can change within just 20 years. And with the continual twin threats of AI and robotics, it can happen overnight. There will always be a change of tack that will be necessary to go with the times. But it's not that the times change, rather our strategies must change as technologies come and go for each generation. Charlie Kirk has famously said, "There was a Gallup poll that Martin Luther King's approval rating was 96% and Jesus Christ's approval rating was 90%. I said, okay, we have a problem." With the birth of the 1964 so-called Civil Rights Act, the American people thought they were getting minor legislative adjustments to help placate blacks. But what they got instead was the birthing of a permanent deep state of bureaucrats that were looking for racism where it didn't exist, and eventually the act was piggybacked by the LGBT WTF mass psychosis that we all suffer under today. By the way, liberals erroneously call this the civil rights era. Our God-given rights were not a flash-in-the-pan era in the 60s. It's a part of our sacred Constitution. The original Bill of Rights, with very few exceptions, was really all any of us ever needed to thrive in this country. But in 1964, liberals were screaming, "Changes are necessary!" Really? What was so horrible about America before these changes? Lynchings? Was the Snivel Rights Act responsible for stopping the lynchings? Certainly not. Awareness of the lynchings gradually stopped the lynchings, but not the Snivel Rights Act itself. What about what they sold us as the horrors of segregation? But what exactly is segregation? Think about this in your own life. If someone says they don't want anything to do with you, do you insist that they still must accept you? Only the weakest of all characters needs to be loved and accepted by all. The last place I want to be is where I'm not wanted and for whatever reason. In fact, the reason I'm rejected doesn't matter at all. Not to me. It could be my skin color or something else entirely. My attitude is you either accept me or you reject me. And if you reject me, I'm history. Because I'm still free to be me and you're still free to be you. No one really gets hurt. Isn't this a type of personal segregation? And isn't this true and present in all our healthy relationships? Even if you accept 95% of someone, but utterly reject the other 5% of them, how can you ever get along with them? And especially if that relationship is forced into existence by law. We all know the answer to that question. We have to accept them, almost totally just to maintain the peace, but we'd still be very unhappy. Or, how about this? Even better. We can simply reject them 100% and be much happier as a result. Women may look at this differently because they love to complain about everyone's flaws, even more than men do. I think all real men know this. Complaining of life's tiniest unfixable imperfections is a woman's unfortunate nature. But if a government forces integration compliance upon us, which goes against our deep personal inclinations toward our very natural same-race attraction, we prefer to be around others who look like us, which is why we strongly tend to marry our own race, and doves don't interbreed with crows. Then if a government forces that relationship, it is saying the government knows better than you whom you should associate with. Then the legal force or civil rights law is going against our preferred natures. There is no more freedom of association, thus creating constant friction as manifested by the Watts riots, Detroit riots, Miami riots, Rodney King riots, Ferguson riots, George Floyd, last summers of anti-love, anti-deportation of illegal alien criminal riots, and now the good and pretty riots. I call them the pretty good riots. And that's just to name a tiny, tiny few. There have been many thousands of these silly riots just in the USA. They grind on and on, it never ends. So in our personal lives, segregation works quite nicely. We do it all the time unconsciously. And it's mutual, almost always. No discussion, no hurt feelings, no shouting, and most important, no race riots. So am I saying that separate but equal is superior to forced integration? Indeed, I am. Because it maintains both peaceful relations and freedom of association. There's nothing more precious than freedom. Liberals should love segregation because it maintains their precious diversity. But they don't because segregation is on their banned books list of ideas that is just too racist. It's clearly not, and the libtards could never persuasively explain just why it's racist in a million years because they're just too stupid to even comprehend their own positions, their own opinions. It's funny, they love segregated dorms and graduation ceremonies, but hate segregation that led to the Snivel Rights Act. But that hypocrisy is easy to explain. Segregation is bad only when it disrupts the world domination and elitist control schemes of their wealthy masters. So their integrationist ideas won, legally and temporarily at least. And so the Snivel Rights era really birthed this idea that it's the federal government's job to actively go against any disparate outcome and try to even the score under the charade of equity or equal outcomes. But equity in real life, historically, has never, ever successfully been achieved. That's just a communist, fascist pipe dream. No matter to them, because again, it's not really about equality of outcomes, it's just that equity is the noble and holy, shiny object for useful idiots. It's really about a government consolidating more and more power for itself. Most of my listeners already know this. It wasn't until after the Civil Rights Act was passed, after the Great Society was passed, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, that Martin Luther King became more radical, talking about how we need to reconfigure society. He talked about how we have not done a good enough job to have moral social justice and economic justice. By the way, anytime hyphens are put in front of the word justice, watch out. Communists and fascists are lurking behind all that bull. Hyphenated justice ain't justice. Now we're just talking about dirty, convoluted politics masquerading as justice. Justice is just justice. True justice is always simple and stupid easy to understand. Otherwise, guess what? Hyphenated justice is the dead bullseye opposite of true justice. Martin Luther King was a self-described minister, but he participated, at the very least, in a dozen extramarital affairs on his wife, and that is well documented. He definitely participated in orgies. Charlie Kirk said, "When a man of the cloth who says he's a man of God does that sort of pattern of behavior, I don't think he should have a higher approval rating than Jesus." So how do we explain that we have built this mythology around MLK in the modern era? The leaders that we lift up should be Washington, Adams, and Lincoln, the founders of our country, not the leeching carpetbagger opportunists who always follow false cries of inequality like scavengers nipping at the heels of the walking dead. MLK has been elevated almost to mythology, but he actually gave us more race focus and less emphasis on character and conduct, and the woke culture that followed in his wake is, many decades later, still obsessed with everyone's individual shade of skin color. That tells me that MLK's followers were not successful in the one thing that everyone tries to give him credit for. That is, character being more important than skin pigmentation. The 1964 Civil Rights Act may have had some good intentions, so it should have focused on very minor legislative adjustments, not the grand sweeping of everything good out of America that was based on hard work and merit, and sweeping all the rubbish based on sniff and snivel complaining into America. It's time to take MLK and anybody else off a pedestal. Let's just look at the tree, and what fruit did it produce? Only 1% of the entire act later built this massive anti-racist federal bureaucracy that wasn't immediately felt until decades later. But that tiny 1% was damning to America. All of a sudden, we notice bureaucrats attacking admission standards with affirmative action because outcomes aren't the same, simply because some students work harder than others. Therefore, any college that rewards genuine achievement is racist, and now the college must bow down to the new mediocrity and conform to the Civil Rights Act or essentially be shut down. But that's not all. They cannot achieve our modern woke enforcement without a strengthened base of that Civil Rights Act. So when you give the federal government power to police private business and private action, then the EEOC is created, which often overreaches into small businesses' private affairs that could be a death sentence to a fledgling business that's just trying to make it. And then, all of a sudden, this act transmogrifies into this weird-ass trans thing that no one who is remotely sane can even comprehend. So this trans insanity is now pink umbrellaed with some really cute tassels under the Civil Rights Act that was once sold to Americans to bring about just a bit more civility in race relations, and now it's a gay Frankenstein out of control and roaming the countryside, shopping for some really cute shoes so as to trample over your legitimate civil rights, and then to impale you by swinging its 6-inch stiletto heels deeply into the proud chest of any American lover of freedom. Real Americans never bought into any of that transsexual BS. The problem, of course, was that Americans were too gullible and trusting of their politicians. Thank God, President Trump attacked Harvard last year using a ninja twist on this law. But Trump's executive actions to stop this madness can only go so far. For example, transsexualism is not just some nonsense flash-in-the-pan, fast profits for big medical and big pharma gimmick. Trans already has deep roots into transhumanism, which is essentially what the Terminator movies are all about. But it's not sci-fi anymore. It's real, turning humans into invincible machines. To me, a Christian, this seems silly. Who wants to live forever? No one, unless your outlook is entirely without Christ. Then wanting to go total transhuman makes total sense. So Christian conservatives have a real fight on their hands. In most law schools, the Civil Rights Act is studied and revered more than the U.S. Constitution. That is reality. It is studied and reviewed more than our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. It shouldn't be because it's only a law, a very flawed one. But your Bill of Rights and the Constitution are foundational laws of the land. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is one of the reasons why we're having so much trouble getting voter ID, and we get these goofy gerrymander districts, and why we have a dangerous lack of election integrity. Americans never wanted the federal Leviathan in the form of anti-racism or your partner in life, which it became because it moved us away from men saying, I'm the protector provider, my wife is my partner, as a family we're going to protect our innocent children. That was healthy and normal. But now we look to the federal government for that, but biblically and constitutionally, that is wrong. Now we have a monstrosity that is aggressively nitpicking everybody around the country to not be such a nasty racist. So to restore accountability, to change all this race-baiting madness is to have individuals transparently visible to the public to whom we can gripe to. We should always return to the original design of America. Like, let me call my city councilman, let me call my mayor, let me call my state senator and talk to them on the phone. Let me call my governor. Those flesh and blood fellow citizens who live in the real world just like me, not protected and hidden by AI systems, but people you may run into at the grocery store or taking a stroll in the town square. That is how you destroy corruption. But without a dominant verse-by-verse teaching church, none of this local control stuff will work either. It will just be corrupted by favor and dealing backroom politics as always. And AI will work better for these corrupted ones, in fact, a lot better. That's why so many non-God-focused politicians are so excited about AI. They see its potential, but in a mostly godless society. Let's now look at how the LG movement metamorphosized into the LGBT WTF crowd. The organizations that fought for homosexual marriage didn't just say, hey, we won, let's close shop and I'll get another career. What they do is say, well, now I gotta promote transgenderism, send us more money and pay us, and we're gonna make sure that transgenders get whatever they want because we got to keep our lazy-ass, high-paying government jobs. It's no different as it relates to DIE, or Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. If your company starts a DIE department and there's really not much discrimination going on, the head of the DIE's not going to come into your office and say, gee whiz, Willikers, boss, things are actually going really swell around here. All the races seem to be really compatible. What they're going to do is try to justify their employment and go start digging up problems. Oh, yeah, there was some discrimination. A white guy on the job mispronounced Laquashakawanda's name, and she thinks it's racist, and so now I had to go have a 3-hour meeting and walk that white boy through on how you pronounce Laquakashanda. Shit! It took us 3 hours, so he thinks he can do it now. So now every university has these overpriced DIE executives and all their underlings, and all they do is sit down in their powwows smoking gangsta, all the while trying to justify their grossly overpaid salaries by making life like a living hell for ordinary people, and all based on, you guessed it, Snivel rights law. Earlier I mentioned Martin Luther King's lack of morals. Why is this so important? If your signature achievement is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then there's the obvious observation to be made that the alphabet mafia has piggybacked on that and now is running roughshod over the country. That's where his sexuality comes into play. Most people who sleep around a lot are exponentially more likely to say, oh, let the gays get married, I don't care what they do, because this justifies their own indiscretions and buries their guilt. And so was MLK's sexual immorality a part of the reason why the Civil Rights Act seemed so unconcerned that the homosexuals, just 5 short years later, with the homosexual Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village, could easily piggyback on his piece of legislation? Maybe that's why there were no principles limiting the expansion of civil rights to every WTF letter in the alphabet, to eventually degrade and destroy America as we once loved it. That was always the plan of the communists. The civil rights movement has always been infiltrated by these snakes. We should never have trusted them. Action step. Don't parrot the SOS. You know what that means. That if you hate the 64 Civil Rights Act, then in some crazy universe, you are evil. That is pure propaganda. Learn to think for yourself. Be sure to rate, review, and share. Give us 5 stars. Do it now while it's fresh in your mind. We are being heavily shadow banned because of content. You've been listening to No PC Allowed. I am Mac Iverson.